Yishborak Shimcha from Eitan Katz from maybe his earliest album called Unplugged. He did an Unplugged 2 and an Unplugged 3, but that's from Unplugged. How are you? Good Vach Shavua Tov. Let's light up the darkness. Who's with us on a Saturday night? And I've got, I think, something really beautiful to share with you. Lindsay in Cincinnati, David in South Bend, Bella in Florida, Bill in mid-Missouri, Yosef in Massachusetts, Paula in Chicago, Shandor in the Bronx, Karen in Northern California, Miriam says Shavua Tov, Leah, hello from L.A. Welcome, everybody. A small and important crowd for when I share this with you. So I just want to tie three little thoughts together before we get into our teaching tonight. Today in synagogue, we read Torah portion Mitzorah. So these were the laws of Tzara'as, continuing from last week. And we discussed the house. Right, so Tzara'as was a condition, a physical manifestation of a spiritual malady, as we've talked many times, that we don't merit to experience anymore. And why would you say we don't merit to experience a disease anymore? Correct. So when the temple was in our midst, when the children of Israel occupied the holy land of Israel as a holy nation, up until the destruction of the second temple, and really in a sense up until the time of the first destruction, we no longer had sovereignty after that. But we had a second temple for hundreds of years, and I'm not sure exactly when Tzara'as went out. Was it with the destruction of the second temple? Was it earlier than that because the spiritual level of the people fell so much? But at any rate, if we, used our tongues unwisely, if we spoke lashon hara, evil tongue, wicked speech, gossip, slander, other kinds of prohibited speech, and a person did that enough, so his body would contract tzara'as, and then he had to have it looked at by the Kohen, by the priest. Interesting, not the most knowledgeable person. There would be rabbis in the community who were even more knowledgeable of the law of tzara'as than a priest. But the priests were the ones charged by the Torah, the descendants of Moses' brother Aaron, and only they could rule whether a particular blemish on the skin was tzara'as or not. So we've discussed that, but there was also the tzara'as of a house. It could look sort of like a mold or some kind of weird infestation on the walls of a house. And then the priest would also be called to look at that, and if it was indeed tzara'as of the house had to be torn down. A very difficult thing for people to experience, as you can imagine. And yet, Rashi tells us that there were instances when a person would have their house condemned with tzara'as of the house, and when they tore it down, they would find the treasure buried there. And this happened more than once, because when the children of Israel ascended into the Holy Land, when Joshua led the children of Israel in, the inhabitants of the land, they had a dread of the children of Israel, and they fled, and they left treasure in their houses, thinking they would come back later after these people were inevitably defeated, which didn't happen. And so these treasures would be found, years, maybe even centuries later, when a person had tzara'as in the house. And of course, a kind of, clear teaching of that, which we should always take to heart, is that very often in life, what looks like an absolute, catastrophe, tragedy, has hidden within it the seeds of a treasure, of a redemption, of a new door opening in life. The door that slammed on you is actually a door that, it turned you in a direction where something new would open in your life. That is wonderful and would not have become available to you but for what seemed like a tragedy, in this case when the house was being torn down. So that was from today's Torah portion. And then our Rabbi, Yekusiel Kalmanson, shared a story that he's shared a couple times before, true story, that during the Holocaust in a concentration camp, so there was a wealthy man who was really at death's door. He realized he might not make it. And there was a rabbi, a young rabbi, in the concentration camp with him who was known to have a photographic memory. He's just one of those geniuses that, every page of Talmud that he had studied, he carried with him, memorized. And every verse of scripture memorized. I mean, just a vast, vast photographic memory. And so the wealthy man said to this young rabbi, I don't know if I'm going to make it. But I have children out there. I don't know what's become of them. I don't know if they'll survive this Holocaust or not. But I want to give to you my account numbers for a Swiss account, right? So this tremendous amount of money deposited in a Swiss account and identified only by the sequence of numbers. Obviously, the trust in the rabbi was tremendous because, the rabbi could have used this for himself. So the man gave over those numbers. The rabbi memorized them. The Holocaust went on. The rich man perished in the concentration camp, and the rabbi built up his rabbinate. He actually ended up being the rabbi in Antwerp, Belgium. I believe the name was Rabbi Kreisberg. 30 years later, I believe he was visiting London, and a meshulach came up to him, a beggar who was collecting, right? In this case, collecting for himself. So somebody collecting charity, very often in an Orthodox synagogue, a daily minyan, people who are collecting charity either for themselves or for institutions walk around, and collect $1 here, $1 there. Maybe wealthy people give them $5, $10. And this rabbi, very often people are a little bit impatient with the guys collecting charity because they just want to focus on their prayers, get through it and get out. People who are kinder, more graceful, I certainly fail at this, but I aspire to be kinder and more graceful to people when I'm in a hurry or feeling in a bad mood and they need my attention. I should do better, particularly with the members of my family, and I apologize for all the times I've been short. But at any rate, this Rabbi Kreisberg started talking to the guy who was collecting charity, asked him a few questions, got to know him a little bit, and then heard something that piqued his curiosity and asked a few more questions and realized that this beggar in London that he's talking to is the son of the wealthy man who entrusted him with the Swiss bank account numbers in the camp 30 years earlier. And the rabbi looks at this guy and says, you're asking me for $1, a pound, whatever it was in London. You don't know how wealthy you really are. Now that sounds like one of these fantasy stories. Okay, yeah, we wish all that would happen to us, but how many people have been so blessed that something like that would happen, that they realize that they were in possession of huge fortunes that they didn't even know about? Okay, it doesn't really happen. But it does. And that our Rav always gives over that story to remind us that all of us are walking around with these vast spiritual fortunes within us that so often go untapped because we don't have access to it, because we don't trust ourselves, because we don't trust God to give us these reserves. But we have tremendous, tremendous abilities within. And we need to believe in ourselves. Why am I mentioning this to you now? Because Passover is coming. I'm going to share with you one more just little but super practical teaching. A lot of us are getting a little bit older. I'm 56. I know there's members of our community who are older than 56. And, as you watch people age, very often their gait, right, their manner of walking starts to bend forward a little bit, crouch in a little bit, and kind of become that old person shuffle, right? That we're very familiar with it. We've seen it a million times. And very often we just think, well, that's what happens when you get older. And the reason is osteoporosis, or the bones are shrinking, or we're getting lighter, or we've been damaged. And there is obviously some truth to all of those reasons. But what I just recently heard, and if somebody else, has heard about this kind of thing too and can give me some confirmation, I'd appreciate it. But as soon as I heard it, this made absolute sense to me. One of the reasons why people start to bend forward and crouch over as they get older is because they're afraid of falling. right? When you're in that position, you're a little bit closer to the ground. You're a little bit braced for that fall because we're afraid of falling. It's obviously a big damage when we get older and we are more brittle. If we fall, there's a bigger price to pay for that fall. But there's nothing inherent in us that makes us crouch over. Why are we afraid of falling? One thing is, okay, the consequences of the fall. The other is we're afraid we're more likely to fall because our balance becomes hampered as we get older. But it turns out that, yeah, our balance does become a little bit more challenged as we get older, perhaps in part because we're carrying so much more around with us. Children just, as soon as they learn to walk, they stand straight up, they run around. They're not carrying that lifetime of experiences and the things that have beat them down a little bit the way we are. But our balance, which suffers a little as we get older, responds incredibly well to work on our balance, right? If we work on balance, like when we're standing in line at the ATM and we stand on one foot, when we're standing on line at the supermarket and we stand on the other foot and kind of move with one foot around a little bit in the air, no one's even going to notice you're working on your balance. But working on your physical balance, getting your shoulders back, and actually doing exercises that promote better balance will allow you to walk upright and feel younger, right? It's not just that you won't shuffle along and it'll be nicer that you're standing straight up. You'll actually feel younger because you're acting younger. And that registered with me right away because something I noticed years ago is that if I'm in a bad mood, if I'm really sad, if I'm just crushed about something that happened, if I go out and take a walk and I walk like a person who is happy, if I have the walk of a person who is happy, I become much happier, like so fast, it's weird. It's stunning that could happen. But if you walk like a happy person, you become much happier really quickly. And if you walk like a younger person, a balanced person, you will feel like a younger and more balanced person, and that will have tremendous impact on all areas of your life. So I bring all these ideas together. The tzaras of a house that ends up yielding a treasure. This man who was a beggar, and it turned out that he had a vast fortune he didn't even know about, and he just had to run into the right person to help him trigger it, as it were. And this idea that it's almost a little bit like fake it till you make it, but if you just work on acting, talking, standing like a younger, more balanced person, you will be that person irrespective of physical age. What is Passover? Passover is a time when we as a people, the Jewish people, discovered that we were not broken, bent over slaves, but actually children of God, and a nation of priests. Priests are even above princes, right? A royal nation, every single one of us. And it was hard for us to reconcile our feelings of inadequacy and being broken and crushed down and living like slaves with discovering that we are actually this free nation of royalty, and that needed a transition. And that transition was Passover. Right? So as we prepare for Passover next Friday night, start thinking now about what it is that's breaking you, that's keeping you down, and that is a chain, a fetter that you've encircled yourself with. No one else is chaining you down. You've done it to yourself by accepting a kind of slavery to a pharaoh that is not real. I mean, if you have tried to quit smoking and you can't quit smoking, okay, well, you have failed before. It doesn't mean you're going to fail again. Nothing is keeping you smoking those cigarettes except yourself. And if you look to God for help with that, maybe you can't do it alone, but God is waiting for you to ask for that help and that assistance to break free. If you're too passive, if you're too angry, if whatever is your pharaoh, start to asking this question, what is my pharaoh, is the first step to discovering what your pharaoh is and being redeemed from that pharaoh and breaking through this year. Just wanted to share that with you as we get ready for Passover week, as it were. Okay. Let me know if this triggers some thoughts for you. All right, we are on page 33 tonight of Tractate Yevamos, the 14th volume of the Talmud. These are the laws of Yibum, levirate marriage. We're in chapter 3 tonight, completing our discussion of Mishnah number 10. Yes, Mishnah number 10. A little bit relevant to what I've been talking about. I mean, really, I'm talking about this because it's Passover week. But the question that the sages are discussing right now in the Gemara is, can you be guilty of two transgressions at the same time? Certainly a priest who is both, who a non-priest who participates in the temple service is, first of all, he's doing a big avera. That's a big sin. Only priests can perform the avoda, the divine service, when the temple is standing. So if a non-priest pretends to be a priest and gets in there and does it, that's a big avera. Well, what if he's also blemished, right? So a blemished priest cannot serve. So this non-priest who's not allowed to serve anyway, if he's also blemished, or if he's tameh, right? He's ritually impure. Is he guilty of two things at the same time, or does only one of them take hold? Perhaps the one that took hold first, or the one that is more severe, and it doesn't matter that he's doing two transgressions simultaneously. Or, yes, there are two transgressions, and even if they're death penalty offenses, he's somehow liable for both of them. What's the flip side of that? They're not doing that discussion here, but can you perform two mitzvahs simultaneously? I mean, sure. If your parent asks you to perform a mitzvah, so then you're doing that mitzvah and honoring your parent at the same time. So that would seem like a double mitzvah. This idea of being unlimited, right? Let's see where the sages take this. If you can be guilty of two transgressions at the same time, well, then you could probably perform two goods at the same time as well. And in fact, maybe you could perform many, many, many goods at the same time. All right, the Gemara comments that the issue of a prohibition taking effect where another prohibition already exists is taught in the dispute found in a Baraisa, where it was stated, with regard to a non-priest who served in some capacity in one of the temple services, such as burning a burnt offering on the altar on Shabbos. Rabbi Hiyya said he is liable to receive punishment on two counts, both because he was a non-priest serving in the temple and because he desecrated Shabbos. You can't do any of the work of the week on Shabbos if you're a Jew. A priest may slaughter an animal and burn it on Shabbos because the Torah commands us to do that, to bring the Shabbos communal offering. So he is not violating Shabbos when he does that. But somebody who's not a priest, even though he's technically acting on behalf of the nation by, pretending to be a priest. What's that word? Not impostoring? What's the verb for when you're an imposter? But at any rate, no, he's not allowed to do that, and he's desecrating Shabbos. So Rabbi Hiyya's position makes sense. Two averas, two sins. Bar Kapara says, no, he is liable on only one count. Rabbi Hiyya jumped up and swore, I swear by the temple service that I heard Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, say this man is liable on two counts. And Bar Kapara jumped up and swore, I swear by the temple service that I heard this from Rabbi, and he said the man was only liable on one count. Now, since the matter could not be decided by tradition, right, since both sages who are arguing opposite positions are quoting the same sage as their source, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the redactor of the Mishna, so then they started to work it out logically. Okay, we can't just rely on what we heard. Let's figure it out ourselves. So Rabbi Hiyya began to deliberate and analyze the question. Prohibited labor on Shabbos was prohibited to all Jews. When prohibited labor was permitted in the temple for the purpose of the temple service, it was permitted only for priests. This indicates that it was permitted for priests, but not for non-priests, everyone else. Therefore, when a non-priest serves in the temple on Shabbos, there is a transgression here due to his serving as a non-priest, and there is a transgression here due to his desecrating Shabbos. Makes sense. What's Bar Kapara going to say? Bar Kapara began to deliberate in a different manner. Shabbos was prohibited to all. When it was permitted in the temple. So that if it was permitted for one to serve in the temple, it was permitted for him to serve on Shabbos. Therefore, there is a transgression here only for his serving as a non-priest, since if this man were a priest, his service would have been permitted. He was just doing what priests do. He wasn't allowed to do that because he's a non-priest, but the only real transgression he did is pretending to be a priest. Impersonate, that's the word I was looking for. Thank you, Nina. So the only real transgression is impersonating a priest, and everything else just follows to that sin. But Hiyya would say, well, no, once he impersonated being a priest, it put him in a position to commit the sin of also desecrating Shabbos. They disagreed over a similar issue as well. The case of a priest with a blemish who served in the temple by sacrificing a public offering, which overrides ritual impurity while he was ritually impure. Now, Rabbi Hiyya says he is liable on 2 counts, both for serving with a blemish. So, for example, a person, a Kohen, who was missing one finger, he had some accident, is unfortunate, but then he's a 9-fingered priest. That's a blemish. He's not allowed to serve in the temple. That would be a permanent blemish. He could never serve as a priest in the temple, as opposed to other more temporary blemishes. But at any rate, a blemished priest not allowed to serve in the temple. Serving while ritually impure, normally not allowed, but during certain circumstances, like where more than half the nation is ritually impure, then a ritually impure priest may serve in the temple. So this man was a priest who was both blemished and ritually impure. So Rabbi Hiyya says he is liable on 2 counts, both for serving with a blemish and for being ritually impure. And Bar Kapara says he is liable only on 1 count, for serving with a blemish. Rabbi Hiyya jumped up and swore, I swear by the temple service. I heard Rebbe say he's liable for 2 counts. And Bar Kapara jumped up and said, I swear by the temple service. I heard Rebbe say he's guilty of only 1. So Rabbi Hiyya began to deliberate, and he analyzed, and he said, ritual impurity was prohibited to all, as it was prohibited for any individual who is ritually impure to enter the temple. When it was permitted in the temple, in circumstances where the entire public was impure, so then it was permitted for priests that were ritually impure to enter the temple, but only if they were unblemished. Therefore, it was permitted only for unblemished priests and not for priests with blemishes. Consequently, if that priest with a blemish served while impure, there is a transgression here due to his status as a blemished priest, and there is a transgression here due to ritual impurity. And Bar Kapara said, ritual impurity was prohibited to all. When it was permitted in the temple, it was permitted for all. Therefore, the only problem was that the priest was blemished, and the only transgression is a blemished priest serving in the temple. And now a third example. This is where they also disagreed over a non-priest who ate a bird sin offering that was killed by Malika, right? That's called Malika? Yeah, Malika, which is pinching the back of its neck. So there were certain bird offerings that when they were brought in the temple, a chicken, for instance, when we eat chicken at home, it has to be shechted by a kosher shochet, right? So like slaughtered in a kosher manner, which is with a very sharp knife across the gullet, etc. But there were sin offerings brought in the temple for people of average wealth, which were 2 doves. And one of them, the priest it was like an actual technique that only priests were permitted to do, which was to slaughter the bird using kind of a sharpened thumbnail on the bird's neck, which is not proper slaughter. And yet, a piece of a sin offering was eaten by a priest in the temple. So, if this is a non-priest who pretends to be a priest and performs Malika and slaughters a sin offering bird in the temple and then eats part of it, so now he has eaten non-shechted meat. Permissible for a priest doing his proper service in the temple, but not for this impersonator, non-priest. So Rabbi Hiyya says he is liable to receive punishment on 2 counts: for being a non-priest who ate from a priestly offering, and for eating something that was not properly slaughtered and therefore not kosher. And Bar Kapara says he is liable on only 1 count. And again, they made their exclamatory vows. Rabbi Hiyya jumped up and said, "I swear by the temple service, I heard Rabbi say this man is liable on 2 counts." And Bar Kapara jumped up and swore, "I swear by the temple service that I heard from Rabbi that this man is liable on 1 count. And Rabbi Hiyya analyzed, an unslaughtered animal carcass was prohibited. Nina, if you're watching, please bring me a glass of water. Thank you. An unslaughtered animal carcass was prohibited to all. When it was permitted in the temple, it was permitted to priests alone. Since it was permitted to priests and not to non-priests, there is a transgression here due to his status as a non-priest who ate of the sin offering, and there is a transgression here due to eating an animal killed by pinching." And Bar Kapara began to deliberate. An unslaughtered animal carcass was prohibited to all. When it was permitted in the temple, it was permitted to all. Therefore, there is a transgression here only for being a non-priest, since if he were a priest, there would be no prohibition at all. Now we're on 33a at the top. The Gemara asks, oh, thank you very much. Thank you. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam sha'akol. It was quite hot in LA the last few days. Today, not as bad as Thursday and Friday, but this room was not cooled during the day, so it's pretty warm in here. Okay, so the Gemara asks, with regard to what principle do they disagree? And the Gemara suggests that they disagree with regard to the issue of a more inclusive prohibition. And this dispute pertains to the status of a more inclusive prohibition, specifically according to the opinion of Rabbi Yosei. Right, so we saw yesterday that this idea is, when can you be liable for 2 prohibitions? When will a second prohibition come and add to your guilt and your penalty if you're already guilty of the first prohibition? And they said yesterday, if the second prohibition somehow expands who would be considered guilty of it compared to the first prohibition. So here we're analyzing according to Rabbi Yosei. So Rabbi Hiyya holds that Rabbi Yosei is of the opinion that in the case of a more inclusive prohibition, one is liable on 2 counts. And Bar Kapara holds that Rabbi Yosei is of the opinion that one is liable on only 1 count. Again, they're looking to the same source and coming out with 2 different conclusions, not on what they heard Rebbe say, but rather on what it is that Rabbi Yosei holds about more inclusive prohibitions. And the Gemara asks, and what more inclusive prohibition is there in these cases? Granted, in the case of a non-priest who served in the temple on Shabbos, initially he was permitted to perform labor every day, and then he was prohibited from engaging in the temple service. That was his initial status. Then when Shabbos came, now he is prohibited from engaging in prohibited labor in all contexts due to Shabbos, and he is also prohibited from engaging in labors related to the temple service due to Shabbos. So indeed, the additional prohibition of Shabbos was added to the previously existing prohibition against performing service in the temple. This is a more inclusive prohibition, since it also includes prohibited labor outside the temple. The same is true with regard to a blemished priest who served in the temple while ritually pure. Initially, prior to his becoming ritually impure, he was allowed to eat from the consecrated animals, but he was prohibited from performing the temple service, like all blemished priests. When he was rendered ritually impure, since he is now prohibited from eating of the consecrated items, he's also prohibited from performing the temple service due to the same ritual impurity. There is then a more inclusive prohibition here. However, with regard to the case of the bird that was killed by pinching, you find that the prohibition against eating consecrated items by a non-priest and the prohibition against eating an unslaughtered animal carcass take effect simultaneously. There was not an additional prohibition on this man. At the same moment, he's prohibited from acting like a priest and eating consecrated animals, and he's prohibited from eating non-kosher meat. And he violated both of those at the same moment. So you do not, however, find a more inclusive prohibition here, as there was no original prohibition that took effect beforehand. Instead, this is a case of two prohibitions that take effect simultaneously. Rather, the previous explanation is rejected, and the Gemara suggests instead that they disagree. I guess Hiyya and Bar Kapara, they disagree with regard to an additional prohibition that takes effect simultaneously. And this dispute pertains to the status of these prohibitions, specifically according to the opinion of Rabbi Yosef. So Rabbi Hiyya holds that Rabbi Yosef is of the opinion that one is liable on two counts in cases of prohibitions that take effect simultaneously. And Bar Kapara holds that Rabbi Yosef is of the opinion that one is liable only on a single count, changing the nature of what it is that they disagree that was Rabbi Yosef's ruling, first on whether there's a more inclusive prohibition taking hold, or no, the issue is when two prohibitions take effect simultaneously, but still they're going to disagree on how Rabbi Yosef would hold for that. So the Gemara challenges this explanation. But here, in the first two instances, what case of simultaneous prohibitions is there here? In the two previous cases, the prohibitions took effect one after the other and not simultaneously. And the Gemara answers that these cases can also be interpreted as occurring simultaneously, like this. With regard to the non-priest who served on Shabbos, this would be a case where a minor grew 2 pubic hairs, meaning a minor became an adult at that moment, signaling adulthood, and it happened on Shabbos. Before that point, he was considered a minor, and therefore he was not liable for his actions. Therefore, this is a case where the prohibition against serving as a non-priest and the prohibition against violating Shabbos took effect together. A super unlikely hypothetical, but their point is they want to analyze the principle of what if the two prohibitions took effect at the same moment. So with regard to the case of one who was blemished, this can be explained as well. It's referring to a case where a minor became an adult, at the same moment became ritually impure. It's a case where the prohibition with regard to a blemished priest and a prohibition with regard to ritual impurity took effect together. Alternatively, it could be a case where he cut off his finger with a ritually impure knife. Here, the cut and the removal of his finger rendered him simultaneously blemished and ritually impure. So following this clarification of the dispute, the matter is now considered from a different angle. Granted, according to the opinion of Rabbi Hiyya, the dispute between his version of Rabbi Yehuda, between Rebbe's ruling and that of Bar Kapara, can be explained like this. When Rebbe taught Rabbi Hiyya, he taught him according to the opinion of Rabbi Yosef. And Rabbi Yosef holds that there are cases where two prohibitions can take effect at the same moment and then be liable for both. And when Rabbi taught Bar Kapara, he did so according to the opinion not of Rabbi Yosef, but of Rabbi Shimon, who holds that a new prohibition can never take effect where another prohibition already exists. Therefore, Rabbi Hiyya could understand why Bar Kapara insisted on his opinion. Rabbi Hiyya thought that Bar Kapara was in fact relating an accurate statement of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, as Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was relating the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Hiyya assumed that Bar Kapara did not understand that Rebbe's statement was not in accordance with Rabbi Yosef's opinion. According to Bar Kapara, however, was Rabbi Hiyya then telling a falsehood? How would Bar Kapara relate to Rabbi Hiyya's oath? Did he think that Rabbi Hiyya would swear that he heard words from Rebbe that were never said? Rather, this must be explained differently. Rabbi Hiyya and Bar Kapara disagree with regard to cases where two prohibitions take effect simultaneously. And this dispute pertains to the status of these prohibitions, specifically according to the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. And it could be suggested that when the two prohibitions take effect simultaneously, Rabbi Shimon would concede that they both take effect. However, this explanation raises a difficulty as well. Granted, according to Rabbi Hiyya, it is clear why he was swearing. He did so in order to exclude the understanding of Rabbi Shimon's opinion that was based on his presumed opinion, as it was known that Rabbi Shimon holds that a new prohibition cannot take effect where another prohibition exists. And this is the default understanding of his opinion. Therefore, it was incumbent upon Rabbi Hiyya to take an oath in order to emphasize that despite Rabbi Shimon's general opinion, in cases where the prohibitions take effect simultaneously, he would concede that both prohibitions can take effect. However, according to Bar Kapara, why was it necessary to swear? It would have sufficed for him to simply make his statement as it concurs with the default understanding of Rabbi Shimon's opinion. And the Gemara comments, indeed, this is difficult. They're really trying to get at how is it possible that two sages not only disagreed on what they heard Rebbe say, not only disagreed on what was Rebbe's source for what he said, but that they felt the need to swear about it as part of their discourse. Why? So one can raise a difficulty with this explanation from a different angle. Granted, according to Bar Kapara, when Rebbe taught him, he taught him according to the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, who holds that two prohibitions cannot take effect simultaneously. And when he taught the ruling to Rabbi Hiyya, he taught it according to Rabbi Yosef. Accordingly, Rabbi Hiyya did in fact swear that he heard that one is liable on only one count, but he wrongly understood that this was Rabbi Shimon's opinion. But then, according to Rabbi Hiyya, who holds that Rabbi Shimon concedes that in cases where the prohibitions take effect simultaneously, one is liable for both, was Bar Kapara lying? His statement would accord neither with Rabbi Shimon nor Rabbi Yosef. So the Gemara answers, Rabbi Hiyya could have said to you that this is what happened. When Rebbe taught him, Bar Kapara, he taught him two cases involving exemptions, i.e. the case of a non-priest who served in the temple on Shabbos and that of the blemished priest who served while ritually impure. Both of these cases are cases of more inclusive prohibitions. And he was informing Bar Kapara that Rabbi Shimon holds them liable on only one count, because Rabbi Shimon holds that a prohibition takes effect where another prohibition already exists only if the prohibitions take effect simultaneously, but not in cases of more inclusive prohibitions. And he taught him the ruling with regard to a more inclusive prohibition that in such cases there is an exemption. And this ruling is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. And Bar Kapara then saw the case of a non-priest who ate a bird killed by pinching, and since it was similar to the previous cases, he mixed them together. And then, sometime later, it seemed to him as though he had in truth heard all these cases together from Rabbi, but when he examined this last case, he found that it could exist only if the events occurred simultaneously. And he concluded that since the case of a non-priest eating a bird killed by pinching can occur only in a scenario where the prohibitions take effect simultaneously, the other cases are instances of simultaneous prohibitions as well. And similarly, since he was taught to exempt one, we're on 33b by the way, since he was taught to exempt one individual from a second prohibition in those cases, these cases were taught to exempt one individual from a second prohibition as well. Therefore, according to Rabbi Hiyya, Bar Kapara did not knowingly speak falsely. Rather, he had heard certain matters from Rebbe and then mistakenly merged with them other matters. And as a result, he confused the issue. You see how the later sages are doing a kind of, it's like they're doing an investigation, like a forensic analysis of how a dispute of earlier sages came up and how they might have arrived at these positions which seemingly are untenable. Now the Gemara raises an objection to the statement of Bar Kapara from a Baraisa in the case of a non-priest who served on Shabbos and the case of a blemished priest who served while ritually impure. There is liability here due to the prohibition against serving as a non-priest and due to the prohibition against desecrating Shabbos and due to the prohibition against serving as a blemished priest and due to the prohibition against serving after contracting ritual impurity. And this is the statement of Rabbi Yosef. So Rabbi Shimon says there's liability here only due to the prohibition against serving as a non-priest and due to the prohibition against serving as a blemished priest. And the Gemara notes, and yet the case of a non-priest who ate a bird killed by pinching was left out and not mentioned among the cases subject to this dispute. Why did they you have this, Rabbi Yosef is guilty of two things, Rabbi Shimon only one, but they left out that third case. And the Gemara asks, according to whom was this left out? That is, according to the opinion of which Tana would this question arise? If we say that this was left out according to the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, it is difficult. Now that Rabbi Yosef holds, even in cases of a more inclusive prohibition, that one is liable on two counts, yeah. And I just want to I'm going to actually stop there. And I'm going to remind us that how did we get here? Why was it so important to figure out whether one is guilty of two transgressions or only one when he seemingly violates two prohibitions at the same time? Why are we talking about that here in Tractate Yevamos? So the connection to Yibum was if a person, right, in that simpler case of two brothers married to two sisters, and then one of them dies, and then the sister, and then a wife dies, can that remaining man and woman marry, right? And so the problem there is, well, he's no longer marrying his wife's sister because his wife died, but that woman was prohibited to him at the moment that his brother died, and she became his Yevama. Also, there's the prohibition of you cannot marry your brother's sister unless it's a Yibum situation, and there would seem to have been prohibited in the Yibum situation itself, and that led us to ask, if you sleep with a woman who is your brother's sister and your sister's wife, have you violated one prohibition or two? Right? And that's how we got into this analysis. We got a little thick in the weeds here, didn't we? There's just a few paragraphs left until we reach Mishnah number 11. I'm going to ask you to do those paragraphs on your own so I can answer a few questions. And then with God's help, tomorrow night we'll pick it up at 6 o'clock with a new Mishnah, Mishnah number 11, here in chapter 3. Also a reminder, we will have class tomorrow night, Sunday, regular time, but no class on Monday as I have a conflict. All right, let's check out questions or comments on Yevamos 33. Nina saying no questions, my brain hurts. Bill, if you're not sure where to start thinking about what your personal Pharaoh is, reflect on the commandment in Leviticus chapter 19 to love one's neighbor as oneself. If you cannot see what is holding you down, ask instead how you can help your neighbors, and you may find your own liberty in the process. Bill, I can't believe you're saying that today to me, because Nina said the exact same thing to me today when I got home from morning davening. Because what happened was there was a there was a simcha by us. There was a bar mitzvah. And then afterward, I went to this party that was the house, and then I came back by our shul, and there were still a few people there, and I was just standing there chatting on the sidewalk, and this man walks by that I don't know very well, who just happens to live in the community and is very wealthy, and and he, I hardly know him at all, but I've had a few interactions with him where in the past I thought to myself, this guy's so arrogant, And anyway, he's chatting with the person next to me, doesn't say hello to me, even though I kind of tried to smile at him, and I think I even said hi when he got there. And then he sort of breaks off that conversation, and almost without looking at me, because I was in uniform. I've shared before that I'm a security guard. I'm a licensed security guard. I'm a volunteer. I mean, I don't get paid, but it's just so that we can protect our small shuls that don't have security guards. So there's a bunch of us volunteers who've gone through extensive training so that we can carry a firearm in synagogue. Right? We do it on Shabbos as well as weekdays. So I had the insignia on my arms, the gun on my belt, the badge on my chest. And he says, this guy didn't get the memo that Purim ended a few weeks ago. And my friend who was standing next to me was very funny. He's like, oh, no, he got the memo. Now the gun is loaded. He's just joking. But the point is, it bothered me that, he's just doesn't even talk to me, but he feels like making fun of me. So I get home and I tell Nina this story, and she says, aha, that's the guy that Rabbi Avigdor Miller says you have to love him as yourself, right? It's not this general command, love your fellow as yourself and feel like, oh, I have love for everybody. But actually, the member of your community that bothers you is the person that you should pray that God will open your heart and that you should have good feelings for this person, and perhaps you even need to pray for that person's well-being like you would want others to pray for you. That's how you love your fellow as yourself, the one that it's challenging for you to love. That's the one that you should learn to love as yourself. I mean, a brilliant reminder and a big challenge. And I feel like I can identify my pharaohs. There are things that are holding me back and that I will definitely be thinking about this week. In fact, we have this practice at our Seder that, you really want to think now, starting tonight, if you haven't already, what is my Pharaoh? So that when you get to the Seder, and you read the story of the Haggadah and how God liberated us from slavery in Egypt, inside, privately, you're thinking about God will help you be liberated from your personal Pharaoh. I love Bill's teaching that if you can't identify what your Pharaoh is, these things that bother you in other people, it might just be, the Lubavitcher Rebbe says the same thing, that what bothers you in other people is a mirror that God has sent your way to note, what it is that you should be concerned about in yourself. I hope that I'm not arrogant, like I think this guy is, and, making jokes at other people's expense and not, being friendly enough to say hello first. That's just not my nature. But it's something I got to think about. Maybe there is something in that guy that even bothers me because it's a mirror in some way. And not just because I felt like I was dissed, by this prominent person. But anyway, lots to think about there. And then Yosef says, my Pharaoh tends to be doubt and fear. We should only be in awe of God and not our Pharaoh. Good. Yes, Yosef. Doubt and fear is paralyzing. And from the recent movie and even better book, Dune, fear is the mind killer. It really is. When you realize that you're a child of God sent into this world on a mission and that God would never send you here without giving you all the tools that you need to complete your mission, then you know that you are a well-armed prince on a heroic mission, and you just need to step into that identity. Have a great night, my holy sisters and brothers. I look forward to learning with you tomorrow night, Sunday at 6 p.m. Pacific.